The stagecoach rattled into San Antonio, Texas, on a blistering afternoon in June of 1877, and Rose Langford pressed her face against the dusty window, searching for a man she had never met but agreed to marry 3 months ago, through letters that promised nothing except a chance at something better than what she was leaving behind. She had grown up in a Philadelphia boarding house where 12 people shared 4 rooms, where privacy meant turning your face to the wall while someone else changed their clothes, where the closest thing she ever had to her own space was the corner of a mattress she shared with 2 younger cousins who kicked in their sleep. The advertisement had been simple, almost brutally so, but it had spoken to something deep in her chest that ached with a longing she could barely name. A rancher in Texas, seeking a wife, it had said. A woman of good character who did not mind hard work and isolation. Rose had written back that same evening, her hands trembling as she dipped the pen in ink borrowed from the boarding house keeper. Now, as the coach lurched to a stop outside a weathered building with a sign that read San Antonio Station, Rose smoothed down her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped down into the brutal Texas heat, the sun so fierce it seemed to press against her skin like a hot iron. The air smelled different here, dry and dusty with hints of horses and mesquite smoke, nothing like the coal smoke and river damp of Philadelphia. She clutched her carpet bag, which contained everything she owned in the world, and scanned the faces of the men who stood in clusters along the wooden sidewalk. Miss Langford? The voice came from behind her, low and uncertain, and Rose turned to find herself looking up at a man who stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar beneath a worn hat, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, green-brown and full of something that looked like worry. His face was tanned and weathered, with lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time squinting into bright horizons, and his hands, which he twisted nervously against his hat brim, were calloused and strong. "I am Samuel Daniels." Rose felt her breath catch, not because he was handsome, though he was in a rough, unpolished way, but because he looked as nervous as she felt, and somehow that made everything a little less terrifying. "Mr. Daniels," she said, extending her hand in what she hoped was a confident gesture. "I am pleased to finally meet you." Samuel took her hand carefully, as though she were made of something fragile, and the touch sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. "The wagon is just over there," he said, gesturing toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 patient horses. "It is about an hour ride to the ranch. I thought, if you are not too tired, we could stop by the church on the way. Reverend Matthews said he would be available this afternoon." Rose swallowed hard. Of course they would marry today. That had been the arrangement after all. She was not here for a courtship, but for a practical union that would benefit them both. Still, her hands felt cold despite the heat, and she had to force herself to nod. That would be fine. The ride to the church passed in a blur of dust and awkward silence. Samuel pointed out landmarks, his voice growing more comfortable as he talked about the land, the creek that ran through his property, the stand of live oaks that provided shade for the house. Rose listened, trying to imagine this place as home, trying to picture herself belonging to these wide open spaces so different from the cramped streets she had always known. When they pulled up outside a small white chapel with a cross that gleamed in the sunlight, her stomach twisted with a combination of fear and something that might have been excitement. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by the Reverend's wife and a ranch hand Samuel had brought along for the purpose. Rose spoke her vows in a voice that trembled only slightly, and when Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she looked down at it in wonder. She had never owned anything gold before. The kiss Samuel pressed to her lips was chaste and quick, but his eyes, when he pulled back, held a gentleness that made her think perhaps this would not be such a terrible gamble after all. The ranch, when they finally reached it as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, was more substantial than Rose had expected. The main house was built of rough timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides and a roof that looked sturdy enough to withstand the storms Samuel had mentioned in his letters. There was a barn set back from the house, a chicken coop, and several corrals where horses stood with their heads hanging low in the heat. Everything was neat and well maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his work, and Rose felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "I will show you inside," Samuel said, helping her down from the wagon with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "It is not fancy, but it is solid, and the roof does not leak." The interior was dim and cool after the brightness outside, and Rose blinked as her eyes adjusted. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a table with four mismatched chairs in the center. There was a rocking chair near the window, a trunk that looked like it served as both storage and seating, and shelves lined with supplies, and a few books. Everything was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and did not see the point in unnecessary decoration. "The bedroom is through there," Samuel said, nodding toward a door on the far wall. His face had gone slightly red, and he would not quite meet her eyes. "I thought, that is, I assumed you might want some time to settle in. I can sleep in the barn tonight if you would prefer." Rose looked at him, this stranger she had just married, and saw the decency in the offer. He was trying to give her time, to not rush something that was already happening so fast it made her head spin. "That is kind of you," she said quietly. "Perhaps for tonight, that would be best." Relief flashed across his face, followed quickly by something that might have been disappointment, but he nodded and picked up her carpet bag. "Let me show you the bedroom then. You must be exhausted from the journey." The bedroom was larger than Rose expected, with a bed that looked handmade but sturdy, covered in a quilt that showed signs of long use. There was a dresser with a cracked mirror, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single window that looked out toward the barn. Samuel set her bag down on the bed and stood awkwardly in the doorway, as though unsure whether he was allowed to enter his own bedroom now that she was here. "I will let you rest," he said. "There is water in the pitcher, and I will bring in some supper in a bit. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it will fill your stomach." After he left, Rose sat down on the bed and let herself take a full breath for the first time since arriving. The room was quiet, more quiet than any place she had ever been, without the constant noise of other people breathing and moving and talking through thin walls. She stood and walked slowly around the space, touching the dresser, the washstand, the window frame, trying to make it feel real. This was her room now, or at least partially hers. She would share it with Samuel eventually, she supposed, but even that thought did not entirely diminish the strange wonder of having a space that was not crowded with other bodies, other needs, other voices. But as she unpacked her few belongings into the dresser, something else began to settle over her. This was Samuel's room, filled with his things, his clothes hanging on pegs, his boots by the bed, his scent of leather and wood smoke, and something earthy she could not quite name. She was the intruder here, the newcomer fitting herself into spaces he had already claimed. The thought made her chest tight with a feeling she could not quite name. Samuel brought supper as promised, and they ate at the table in awkward, near silence, the scrape of spoons against bowls sounding unnaturally loud. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle he ran on the land he leased from a larger outfit, about the horses he was trying to breed, about his plans to expand if the next few years went well. Rose listened and asked questions, grateful for the neutral territory of business talk, and tried not to think about the bedroom that was not really hers, about the barn where her new husband would sleep because she was too afraid to share a bed with him yet. That night, lying alone in the big bed, Rose stared at the ceiling and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the Texas night. Crickets sang in waves, something howled in the distance, and the house creaked and settled around her. She thought about the boarding house in Philadelphia, about the cousin who would be wondering where she had gone, about the life she had left behind without much regret. Then she thought about Samuel, sleeping in the hay in his own barn because she was in his bed, and guilt twisted in her stomach. He had been nothing but kind, nothing but patient, and she was disrupting his entire life. The next morning, Rose woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and lay still for a moment, disoriented by the silence and space around her. Then memory flooded back, and she sat up quickly, pushing her hair out of her face. She needed to prove her worth, needed to show Samuel that she could be a proper wife, that he had not made a mistake in sending for her. She dressed quickly in her oldest dress and went out to the kitchen, determined to have breakfast ready before he came in from his morning chores. She was attempting to coax the stove to life when the door opened and Samuel stepped in, his hair damp as though he had dunked his head in the water trough. He stopped when he saw her, surprise crossing his face. "You are up early," he said. "I wanted to make breakfast," Rose said, then looked down at the stove, which was producing more smoke than heat. "Though I confess I am not familiar with this type of stove." Samuel crossed the room in 3 long strides and adjusted something in the firebox, and suddenly the flames caught properly. "It takes a bit of getting used to," he said. "The damper sticks sometimes. Here, let me show you." He stood close behind her as he demonstrated how to adjust the airflow, and Rose was acutely aware of his height, his warmth, the smell of honest sweat and hay that clung to him. His hands, as he showed her the technique, were patient and careful, and when he stepped back, she found herself missing the closeness even as it had made her nervous. Breakfast was simple, eggs from the chickens and more cornbread left from the night before, but Samuel ate like it was a feast, praising her cooking even though she had done little more than not burn things. After, he hesitated at the door, his hat in his hands. "I need to ride out and check the cattle in the north pasture," he said. "Will you be all right here alone?" Rose straightened her spine. "Of course, I will find things to occupy myself." After he left, Rose explored the house more thoroughly, taking inventory of what was there and what was needed. The place was clean, but showed signs of a man living without a woman's touch for years. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no softness anywhere. The pantry was adequately stocked with basics, but lacked variety. She found cleaning supplies and set to work scrubbing and organizing, grateful for the familiar rhythm of work to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on her situation. It was while she was sweeping the porch that she noticed the space beside the house, a flat area near a stand of trees that got afternoon shade. It was just empty ground, but something about it caught her attention, made her pause with the broom in her hands. She stood there for a long moment, an idea forming that she barely dared to let herself think. Samuel returned as the sun was setting, dusty and tired, and stopped short when he saw the house. Rose had managed to find some wildflowers growing near the creek and had put them in a jar on the table, and she had aired out the rooms and swept the floors until they gleamed. The windows sparkled in the last light of day, and something that smelled like beans and salt pork bubbled on the stove. "Rose," he said, and his voice held something like wonder. "You did not have to do all this. I wanted to earn my keep," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I want to be useful." Samuel set down the saddle he was carrying and crossed to her, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You do not have to earn anything," he said quietly. "You are my wife now. This is your home as much as it is mine." But that was exactly the problem, Rose thought. It did not feel like her home. It felt like Samuel's home, where she was a guest trying not to be a burden. She did not say this, though. Instead, she served supper and listened to Samuel talk about his day, about the calf that had been born that morning, about the fence that needed mending. She washed the dishes while he sat in the rocking chair and read from a newspaper that was 3 weeks old, and when bedtime approached, the awkwardness descended again. "I can sleep in the barn again," Samuel offered, but Rose could see the weariness in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged. "No," she said, making a decision. "This is your home. I will not drive you out of your own bed." She took a breath. We are married. We can share the room. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, but he just nodded. I will give you time to change, he said, and stepped outside. That night they lay on opposite sides of the bed, so careful not to touch that Rose's muscles ached from holding herself rigid. She could hear Samuel breathing in the darkness, could feel the warmth of him across the space between them, and she wondered if this strangeness would ever fade, if they would ever be comfortable with each other. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her and she slept, and if she dreamed of rooms of her own, she did not remember it in the morning. The days settled into a pattern. Rose worked in the house and garden, learning the rhythms of the ranch, while Samuel worked the cattle and horses from dawn until dusk. They were polite to each other, careful, like two people dancing around something fragile. Samuel never pushed her, never demanded anything she was not ready to give, and Rose was grateful for his patience, even as she felt guilty for requiring it. At night they lay in the bed like two statues, and slowly, incrementally, the space between them began to shrink. It was nearly 2 weeks after her arrival that Rose finally gathered the courage to ask. They were eating supper, the evening light slanting through the windows, and she set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. Samuel, she said, I wanted to ask you something. He looked up, his eyes attentive. Of course, what is it? Rose took a breath. The space beside the house near the trees. Is there a particular purpose for that ground? Samuel frowned slightly, clearly trying to picture what she meant. No, I cannot say there is. It is just empty ground. Why do you ask? This was it, the moment to voice the want that had been growing in her chest since that first day. I was thinking, she said carefully, that perhaps a room could be built there. A small room, just for me. A place where I could sew or read or simply sit. My own space. She watched his face as the words registered, saw confusion, followed by something that looked like hurt, flash across his features. You want a room away from me? He said, and his voice was flat, carefully neutral. Not away from you, Rose said quickly, leaning forward. Samuel, please understand. I have never in my entire life had a space that was just mine. I shared rooms with cousins, aunts, strangers, whoever the boarding house keeper needed to fit in. I slept 3 to a bed sometimes. I never had a place where I could close a door and just breathe without worrying about disturbing someone else or having them disturb me. She twisted her hands together, trying to find the right words. The bedroom is lovely, but it is your room. It has always been your room. Your things are there, your space. I feel like I am borrowing it, like I am a guest who might overstay her welcome. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed her words. Finally, he said, I do not want you to feel like a guest. You are my wife. I know, Rose said softly. But being your wife does not change the fact that I have never had anything of my own. Can you understand that? Just a small room, just a little space that is mine to arrange as I wish, where I can go when I need quiet. It would not change anything between us. I would still share the bedroom with you, still take care of the house, still be your wife in every way. But I would also have that one thing, that one space that is just for me. She watched the emotions play across his face, saw him struggling with something he clearly did not fully understand. But then his expression softened, and he reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles. I cannot pretend to understand exactly what you mean, he said slowly. I have always had space, always had room to myself when I wanted it. But I can see that this matters to you, and that is enough. He squeezed her hand. I will build you your room. Rose felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and hot. Truly, truly, Samuel said, and now he was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I want you to be happy here, Rose. I want this to feel like your home, not just mine. If a room of your own will help with that, then you will have it. That night, when they lay down in the bed, Rose did not hold herself quite so rigidly apart, and when she woke in the early morning to find Samuel's arm had somehow found its way across her waist in sleep, she did not immediately pull away. Instead, she lay still and let herself feel the weight and warmth of it, the strange comfort of another person's presence, and thought perhaps she was beginning to understand what it meant to build a life with someone. Samuel started work on the room the very next morning. Rose watched from the porch as he paced out the dimensions, as he marked the ground with stakes and string, and her heart swelled with something she was afraid to name. He rode into San Antonio that afternoon and returned with a wagon full of lumber, and when Rose asked how he had paid for it, he just shook his head and said it was an investment in their future. The work was hard and time-consuming. Samuel still had the ranch to run, the cattle to tend, the daily chores that could not be neglected. But every spare moment he had, he spent on the room. Rose would watch him through the kitchen window as she worked, see the way his muscles strained as he lifted beams into place, the careful precision with which he measured and cut, the determined set of his jaw when something did not fit quite right. He was building this for her, pouring his energy and skill into creating something she had asked for, and the knowledge of it made her chest ache with an emotion that was becoming harder to deny. Sometimes she would bring him water or coffee, and they would stand together in the shade and look at the progress. "It will have 2 windows," Samuel told her, pointing to the frames he had built. "One facing east for morning light, one facing the creek. And I am building a window seat on the east side so you can sit and watch the sunrise if you want." "A window seat?" Rose said, her voice catching. She had not asked for anything so fine. "Well," Samuel said, and his ears went a bit red, "I figured if you are going to have a room, it should be comfortable. Somewhere you actually want to spend time." He cleared his throat. "I am also making shelves along one wall for books or whatever you want to put there. And there will be a small stove so you can keep warm in winter without having to heat the whole house." Rose stared at him. This man she had known for less than a month, who was giving her something she had not even fully known she needed. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. Samuel set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Because you asked for it," he said simply. "Because it matters to you, and because I want you to want to stay. Not just feel obligated to stay." The honesty in his words took her breath away. "Samuel," she said, "I made a commitment when I married you. I am not going anywhere." "I know that," he said, "but I want more than commitment, Rose. I want you to be happy. I want you to look at this place and see home, not just duty." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "You came here because you needed something different, something better. I aim to give that to you, if you will let me." Rose found herself swaying toward him, drawn by the warmth in his eyes and the solid strength of him. "You are a good man, Samuel Daniels," she whispered. "I am trying to be the man you need," he said, and then he kissed her, properly this time, not the chaste press of lips from their wedding, but a real kiss that made her toes curl in her boots and her hands come up to grip his shoulders. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers and said, "I am falling in love with you, Rose. I thought you should know that." Rose's heart hammered against her ribs. "I think," she said carefully, "that I might be falling in love with you too." After that, things changed between them. The careful distance dissolved, replaced by a growing warmth and ease. Samuel would catch her hand as they passed each other, pull her close for a quick kiss when he came in for meals. Rose found herself looking for excuses to bring him things while he worked, just to be near him, to watch the play of muscles under his shirt and the concentration on his face. At night, they no longer clung to opposite sides of the bed, but tangled together, learning the shape and feel of each other, building an intimacy that went beyond the physical into something deeper and more lasting. The room took shape day by day. First, the frame went up, solid posts and beams that Samuel set with careful precision. Then the walls, rough planks that he fitted and nailed until they formed a tight seal against wind and weather. He built the roof with the same care he had used on everything else, making sure it would shed water properly and tie seamlessly into the existing house structure. Rose watched it all with a sense of wonder that never quite faded, amazed that this was happening, that Samuel was giving her this gift without resentment or complaint. One evening, about 3 weeks after he had started, Samuel came in for supper with sawdust in his hair and a tired smile on his face. "It is almost done," he told Rose as she set a plate in front of him. "Another few days and you can move your things in." Rose slid into the chair beside him rather than across from him, a new habit they had developed, sitting close enough to touch. "I cannot believe you have done this so quickly," she said, "and while managing everything else." Samuel shrugged. "I have been motivated," he said, and the look he gave her made her blush. "Besides, I want to see your face when it is finished." Those last few days seemed to drag by with agonizing slowness. Samuel installed the windows, real glass panes that must have cost a fortune, and built the window seat with a lift-up lid for storage. He finished the shelves and sanded them smooth, installed the small cast-iron stove with a chimney that rose up beside the main house, and built a door that hung straight and closed with a satisfying click. Rose was not allowed to look inside while he put on the finishing touches, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. Finally, on a warm evening in late July, Samuel came to find her where she was tending the vegetable garden she had planted. "It is ready," he said, and his voice held barely contained excitement. Rose set down the basket of tomatoes she had been picking and wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly pounding. Samuel took her hand and led her around the side of the house to where the new room stood, looking like it had always been part of the structure, like it belonged. The door was painted a soft blue, the same color as the dress she had worn the day she arrived, and Rose realized with a start that Samuel must have noticed, must have remembered. "Go on," Samuel said, gesturing to the door. "It is yours." Rose's hands trembled as she lifted the latch and pushed the door open. For a moment, she could only stand in the doorway and stare, her throat tight with emotion. The room was perfect, better than anything she had imagined. The windows let in golden evening light that made everything glow. The window seat was cushioned with fabric she recognized as having come from a dress Samuel's mother had made, something he must have kept stored away and repurposed for her comfort. The shelves stood ready and waiting, and the little stove in the corner promised warmth when the weather turned cold. The walls had been whitewashed, so they gleamed clean and bright, and there was a small table beneath the west window, with a chair pulled up to it. But it was what was on the table that made Rose's breath catch in her throat. A stack of new paper, creamy and smooth, more than she had ever owned at once. A set of pens and a bottle of ink. And beside them, 3 books with leather bindings that looked brand new, their titles stamped in gold. "Samuel," she whispered, and her voice broke on his name. He came up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "I thought you might like to have some things to fill the space," he said. "The books, they are novels. The shopkeeper in San Antonio said they were popular with ladies, and I thought you might want to write letters or maybe just write for yourself. I know you like words." Rose turned in his arms, tears streaming down her face, and Samuel's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Rose, what is wrong? If you do not like it, I can change things. It is perfect," she said, cutting off his worried words. "Samuel, it is the most perfect thing anyone has ever done for me. I do not have words for what this means." She reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with all the love and gratitude and wonder that was flooding through her. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for seeing me, for hearing what I needed even when I could barely say it myself. Thank you for caring enough to do this." Samuel held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "You are my wife," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your happiness matters to me more than almost anything. I would build you a dozen rooms, if it would make you smile like this." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other in the doorway of Rose's new room, the evening light painting everything gold around them. Finally, Rose pulled back enough to look up at him. "I love you," she said, and the words came easily now, natural as breathing. "I did not expect to, did not even think it was possible when I got on that stagecoach in Philadelphia. But I love you, Samuel Daniels, with everything I am." Samuel's smile was like sunrise, bright and full of promise. "I love you too, Rose. More than I thought possible." He kissed her again, soft and sweet, and then said, "So this room, it is everything you wanted?" Rose looked around again, taking in every detail, every thoughtful touch. "It is more than I wanted," she said honestly. "I asked for space and you gave me sanctuary. I asked for walls and you gave me beauty. This is beyond anything I dreamed of." "Then you will use it?" Samuel asked. "You will come here when you need to?" "I will," Rose promised. "But Samuel, you must understand something. This room, wonderful as it is not what has made this place home. You have done that. Your kindness, your patience, your willingness to try to understand what I needed, even when it made no sense to you. That is what has made me want to stay, what has made me fall in love with you." She took his hand and pressed it to her heart. "The room is a gift I will treasure always, but you are the gift that changed my life." That night, they made love in the big bed with a tenderness and passion that felt new, felt like a beginning rather than an obligation. And afterward, as Rose lay curled against Samuel's side, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she thought about how strange life was, how you could leave everything you knew in search of something you could barely name and find instead something you never knew existed. She had come to Texas looking for space and ended up finding love. She had asked for a room and received a home. She had expected duty and discovered partnership. The next morning, Rose carried her few personal items to the new room and arranged them on the shelves. Her mother's hairbrush, worn smooth from years of use. The small Bible her aunt had pressed into her hands when she left Philadelphia. A piece of lace she had been working on for months, patient needlework done in stolen moments. They looked small and lost on the wide shelves, but that was all right. She would fill the space gradually, with things that mattered, with things she chose. This was her place to grow into. She sat at the small table and opened one of the books Samuel had bought her, losing herself in the story of distant places and other lives. The morning light streamed through the east window, warming her face, and the sounds of Samuel working in the barn drifted through the open door. It was peaceful in a way she had never experienced before, the quiet broken only by pleasant sounds rather than invasive ones, the space hers to occupy without apology or negotiation. When Samuel came to fetch her for the midday meal, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at her for a moment, his expression soft. "You belong there," he said quietly. "In that light, in that space. You look like you have finally found where you are supposed to be." Rose closed the book and went to him, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. "I have found where I am supposed to be," she said. "But it is not just the room. It is here, with you. This whole place, this life we are building together. That is where I belong." As summer deepened into the brutal heat of August, Rose settled into her new life with increasing confidence. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, learned which chickens were the good layers and which were just loud, learned how to read the sky for signs of weather and the cattle for signs of trouble. She learned Samuel, too, his quiet humor and steady patience, his fierce loyalty and unexpected gentleness. And slowly she began to teach him about herself, sharing stories of her past over evening meals, letting him see the scars and strengths that had made her who she was. The room became her refuge in the best possible way. She would retreat there in the hot afternoons when the household chores were done, reading her books or writing letters to the few people back in Philadelphia who cared to hear from her. She would sit in the window seat and watch the ranch spread out before her, learning to love the harsh beauty of this place, the wide sky, and the tough land that demanded respect. Sometimes Samuel would join her, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall while she read aloud to him, his eyes closed and a peaceful expression on his face. But the room never became a place of separation, never drove a wedge between them as Rose had worried it might. Instead, it seemed to strengthen their bond, giving Rose the space she needed to remain herself while she learned to be part of a partnership. She could retreat to her room when she needed solitude and emerge refreshed and ready to engage with Samuel and the world. And because she had that option, she found she needed it less than she might have otherwise, secure in the knowledge that it was always there if she wanted it. One evening in September, as the worst of the heat finally began to break, Rose realized with a start that her monthly courses had not come. She sat very still in her room, her hand pressed to her flat stomach, and tried to remember when they should have arrived. 2 weeks late, she calculated. Perhaps 3. She had been so busy, so wrapped up in the newness of everything, that she had not noticed until now. She did not say anything to Samuel that night, wanting to be sure before she raised his hopes. But when another week passed with no sign of her courses, she could no longer deny the truth. She was carrying Samuel's child. The knowledge filled her with a complex swirl of emotions, joy and fear and wonder all tangled together. She was going to be a mother. She and Samuel were going to have a baby. She told him on a Sunday morning when they had slept late, the luxury of a day without pressing work making them lazy and content. They were still in bed, the morning light slanting through the window, and Rose was curled against Samuel's side, his arm around her shoulders. "Samuel," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He tilted his head to look at her, his eyes warm and curious. "What is it?" Rose took a breath, suddenly nervous despite the fact that she knew he would be happy. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply. "Our baby." For a moment, Samuel just stared at her, his expression frozen in shock. Then his face broke into the widest smile Rose had ever seen, and he pulled her on top of him, laughing with pure joy. "A baby?" he said. "Truly? You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor," Rose said, laughing too at his exuberance. "But yes, I am sure." Samuel kissed her thoroughly, his hands cradling her face like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Rose," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "you have made me the happiest man in Texas. A baby. Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Rose asked, though the answer was written all over his face. "Pleased," Samuel said. "Rose, I am over the moon. I am beyond pleased. I am terrified and thrilled, and so full of love I could burst." He placed his hand gently on her stomach, his expression full of wonder. "There is a baby in there, our child." They spent the day making plans, talking about everything from names to how they would arrange the house to accommodate a child. Samuel was adamant that Rose not overwork herself, that she rest and take care, and Rose had to remind him gently that pregnancy was not an illness and that she would continue to pull her weight on the ranch. But his concern was endearing, evidence of how much he already loved this child they had created together. As Rose's belly began to swell with the growing baby, the room Samuel had built for her took on new significance. It became a place where she could rest when the pregnancy made her tired, where she could sit and dream about the future while her hands moved over the tiny garments she was sewing. Samuel installed a daybed along one wall, insisting that she needed a place to nap that was not their bed. And Rose did not argue because she could see how much he needed to do things for her, to feel like he was taking care of her and their child. The baby was born on a cold night in late March of 1878, arriving after a labor that was long and difficult but ultimately successful. Samuel paced the kitchen while a midwife from town attended to Rose in the bedroom, and when the baby's first cry rang out, he nearly broke down the door in his haste to get to them. Rose, exhausted and sweat-soaked, held up their son, a red-faced, squalling bundle with dark hair and lungs that suggested he would never have trouble making his needs known. "A boy," Rose said, her voice hoarse from effort, but her eyes shining with joy. "Samuel, we have a son." Samuel knelt beside the bed, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the baby's tiny fist. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Rose, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James after Samuel's father, who had died before Samuel could bring a wife home to meet him. James Daniels, born to a mail order bride and a cowboy, born into a house that had grown to accommodate dreams and needs, born into a love that had started as a practical arrangement and grown into something neither of his parents could have imagined that hot June day when Rose stepped off the stagecoach. The first months with a baby were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. James proved to have a will of iron and lungs to match, and there were many nights when Rose and Samuel took turns walking him around the house, trying to soothe him back to sleep. But there were also moments of pure magic, like the first time James smiled, or the way his tiny hand would curl around Samuel's finger, or the peaceful weight of him sleeping on Rose's chest. Rose found that the room Samuel had built for her became even more valuable with a baby in the house. When James was napping and the chores were done, she could retreat there for an hour of peace, reading or simply sitting in silence, recharging so she could face the next round of feeding and changing and soothing. Samuel understood, never begrudged her that time, and would take over watching the baby so she could have it. And in the evenings, when James was finally settled for a few hours, Rose and Samuel would collapse together in their bed and hold each other, exhausted but happy, partners in the great adventure of raising a child. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Samuel's hard work paid off, and he was able to buy some of the land he had been leasing, securing their future in a way that made them both breathe easier. They added to the house, building a proper nursery for James and expanding the kitchen. But the room Samuel had built for Rose remained hers, her sanctuary, the space that reminded her that she was still herself, even as she became mother and rancher's wife, and all the other roles she now inhabited. James was 3 years old when Rose realized she was pregnant again, and this time the news was met with experience rather than shock. They knew what to expect now, knew the rhythm of pregnancy and birth and new life. Their daughter was born on a bright October morning in 1881, arriving so quickly that Samuel barely had time to fetch the midwife. They named her Catherine, after Rose's mother, who she had lost so young, and James was immediately besotted with his tiny sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding. With 2 children, the house that had once seemed so spacious began to feel full, but it was a good fullness, the kind that comes from life and love and growth. Rose often looked around at the chaos of toys and laundry and small people demanding attention and marveled at how far she had come from that girl on the stagecoach who had owned nothing more than what fit in a carpet bag. She had a home now, a real home, with a husband who loved her and children who depended on her, and a small room of her own where she could go when she needed to remember who she was beyond all those roles. Samuel remained her partner in every sense of the word. He changed diapers and told bedtime stories, taught James to ride, and held Catherine when she cried. He still worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, but he made time for his family, understanding that his children would only be young once, and that Rose needed his support to manage everything. And on their anniversary each year, he would bring Rose wildflowers, the same kind she had put in a jar that first day, and tell her that marrying her was the best decision he had ever made. The years rolled on, marked by the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that makes up a life. There were good years when the cattle thrived, and bad years when drought or disease took their toll. There were moments of pure happiness, like James's first successful horse ride alone, or Catherine's delighted laughter when Samuel swung her up onto his shoulders. There were also harder times, like when Rose's old aunt back in Philadelphia died, and Rose mourned for the few good memories she had of her childhood, or when a fever swept through San Antonio, and they held their children close and prayed. Through it all, the room remained a constant, a touchstone that reminded Rose of the gifts Samuel had given her all those years ago. She taught Catherine to read there, sitting together in the window seat while James played outside with his father. She wrote long letters there, maintaining connections with the few people from her past who still mattered. She sat there on difficult days and let herself feel whatever she needed to feel, secure in the knowledge that this space was hers, that no one would intrude unless invited. When James was 10 and Catherine was 7, Rose found herself pregnant again, a surprise that left both her and Samuel slightly stunned. They had assumed their family was complete, had settled into the rhythm of life with older children who were increasingly independent. But life, Rose had learned, rarely went exactly according to plan. Their second son was born in the spring of 1888, a calm, placid baby who seemed to take everything in stride, the complete opposite of his volatile older brother. They named him Matthew, and he became the baby of the family, adored and spoiled by his older siblings and parents alike. By the time Matthew was old enough to walk, Rose was 40 years old, and Samuel was 44. They had been married for more than a decade, had built a life together that bore little resemblance to the careful arrangement they had started with. The ranch was successful, their children healthy, and their love for each other had only deepened with time and shared experience. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, had fought and made up, had held each other through grief and celebrated together in joy. One evening, when Matthew was tucked in bed and the older children were absorbed in their own activities, Samuel took Rose's hand and led her out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was finally cooling after the heat of the day. They sat together in the rocking chair Samuel had built wide enough for two, and he pulled her close against his side. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "when you first asked me to build you that room?" Rose smiled, her head resting on his shoulder. "I remember being terrified that you would be angry, that you would think I was rejecting you." "I did think that," Samuel admitted. "At first, I could not understand why you would want space away from me, why the bedroom was not enough." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But you were right to ask for it. That room, it has been good for you, good for us. It gave you what you needed to truly make this place home." Rose turned in his arms to look up at him. "You gave me what I needed," she said. "The room was just wood and nails. You gave me understanding and patience and love. You gave me a partnership where I could be myself and still be part of something bigger. That is what made this place home." Samuel's eyes were bright in the fading light, and Rose could see all the years they had shared reflected in them, all the love and struggle and triumph. "I love you, Rose Daniels," he said. "I loved you that first day when you stepped off the stagecoach looking like you were trying to be brave. I loved you when you asked for something I did not understand but built it anyway. I loved you when you gave me James and Catherine and Matthew. I love you now, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if I can manage it." Rose felt tears prick at her eyes, the good kind that came from being overwhelmed with happiness rather than sadness. "I love you too," she said, "more than I ever thought possible. You took a scared girl who had never had anything of her own and gave her everything. A home, a family, a life worth living. And yes, a room, but more importantly, you gave me yourself, your strength and your kindness and your steadfast presence. That is the real gift." They sat there as the stars came out, wrapped in each other, and the comfortable silence of people who have said everything that needs saying. Inside, they could hear the sounds of their children, James reading aloud to Catherine, Matthew babbling to himself in his crib. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they had worked and fought for, the space that had tested them and shaped them and made them into who they were. Years later, when Rose was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren climbing on her lap, she would still retreat sometimes to that room Samuel had built for her. It had been expanded over the years, a second story added to accommodate the growing family, but her original room remained exactly as it had been, preserved like a sanctuary. She would sit in the window seat that Samuel had crafted with his own hands, now worn smooth from decades of use, and remember. She would remember the girl she had been, desperate and hopeful and scared, stepping off a stagecoach into an unknown future. She would remember Samuel's nervousness on that first day, the way his hands had twisted his hat brim, the unexpected gentleness in his eyes. She would remember asking for something she needed but could barely articulate, and the way he had given it to her without fully understanding but with complete trust. She would remember the years of building a life together, of learning to love and be loved, of becoming partners in the truest sense. And she would remember that first evening when the room was finished, when she had stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face, and Samuel had held her and promised to build her a dozen rooms if it would make her smile. He had built her one room, but in doing so, he had given her an entire world. He had given her space to be herself, and in that space she had found the courage to open her heart completely. The room had been a gift, but Samuel's love was the treasure, and Rose had spent the rest of her life grateful for both. The room stood for decades, long after Rose and Samuel were gone, a testament to a love that started with a letter and a leap of faith. Their children would tell the story to their children about how their grandmother came to Texas on a stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a hope for something better, and how their grandfather built her a room of her own because she had never had one before. It became family legend, the story of how sometimes the smallest gestures carry the deepest meaning, how listening to what someone needs, even when you do not fully understand it, is an act of profound love, and how a room built in a single month could become the foundation for a lifetime of happiness. Rose had asked for space, and Samuel had given her sanctuary. She had asked for walls, and he had given her a home. She had come to him a stranger, and he had made her his partner. And in the end, the room was not really about the room at all. It was about being seen, being heard, being valued for who you were rather than who you were expected to be. It was about a man who loved a woman enough to build her something she needed, even when it made no logical sense to him. It was about trust and respect, and the kind of love that grows slowly, rooted in small daily kindnesses rather than grand romantic gestures. The mail order bride had never had a room of her own. The cowboy built her one that same month, and in doing so, he built them both a future neither could have imagined, full of love and children and years of partnership that sustained them through everything life could throw at them. It was not a fairy tale because real life never is. There were hard times and disagreements and moments of frustration, but underneath it all was a bedrock of love and respect, and the memory of a man who had listened to what his wife needed and moved mountains to give it to her. That was the real story, the one that mattered. Not just the room, but what the room represented, the willingness to put someone else's needs ahead of your own understanding, the ability to trust that if something matters to the person you love, it should matter to you too, even if you cannot fully grasp why. The recognition that everyone needs space to be themselves, and that giving someone that space does not push them away, but rather gives them room to come closer on their own terms. Samuel had understood that, perhaps not consciously at first, but in his bones, in the way he acted rather than the words he spoke. And Rose had understood it too, had known that asking for that room was not a rejection, but an invitation, a way of saying, I want to stay, I want to make this work, but I need this one thing to make it possible. They had both been brave in their own ways, and their bravery had been rewarded with a love that lasted a lifetime. In the end, when Rose lay on her deathbed at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some of her last words were about that room. Samuel had died 2 years earlier, and Rose had missed him every single day since, feeling his absence like a missing limb. But as she lay there, slipping in and out of consciousness, she smiled and said clearly, He built me a room. Did I ever tell you that? Samuel built me a room because I asked for it, and that was when I knew. That was when I knew he was going to be everything. Her oldest son, James, now a grandfather himself, held her hand and said gently, "We know, Ma. You told us 1,000 times. The room is still there, waiting for you." "Not the room," Rose said, her voice growing fainter. "The love, the love that built the room. That is what is waiting." And with that, she closed her eyes for the last time, a smile on her face, and went to find the man who had given her everything, starting with a room of her own. The room remained, though, long after Rose and Samuel were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. It remained as a reminder, a symbol, a piece of history that spoke to something fundamental about love and respect and partnership. Future generations would preserve it, understanding instinctively that it represented something important, even if they could not quite put it into words. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slanted just right through the western window, you could almost feel the presence of the woman who had made this room her sanctuary, and the man who had loved her enough to give her exactly what she needed.